Hey everybody, it's been some time since our initial release of the Introduction to SharePoint Framework course, and I am long overdue to be doing an update video to talk about all of the exciting stuff that has changed since the end of 2018, whenever the course was first released. We're going to start today with this 1.7 video, which is going to take a look at the new features that are available in SharePoint Framework version 1.7, which was actually released about the same time that we released the course. Kind of poor timing on our part, but that means that there's been some cool new features that we haven't covered in the course, and we want to make sure that you guys are familiar with it, and we show you some examples on how to use this. We're also going to follow up this video with a 1.8 video, which there's a whole bunch of really cool stuff in 1.8 that we also want to make sure you're familiar with. But we're going to start with 1.7, go in chronological order so you can see all of the new stuff that you have available in SharePoint Framework. And of course, in the future, as updates are released, we're always going to keep you up to date just as a benefit of purchasing the course. So let's take a look at SharePoint Framework version 1.7. And first of all, the main features that were available in 1.7 that were not in preview, meaning that they were not a beta version of the feature, are number one, you now have SharePoint 2019 support. So if you are using SharePoint Server 2019, you can go ahead and choose that as an option whenever you're creating a new project using the Yeoman generator. Another feature that was released with SharePoint Framework 1.7 is a feature called Dynamic Data, and that's going to be the focus of today's update video because it's actually a really cool and much requested feature that basically allows us as developers to have multiple custom web parts on a page and they can talk to each other. And the way that dynamic data works in SharePoint Framework is essentially you can add some code to your custom web part to make it a publisher of dynamic data. And then in turn, other web parts on the page can become consumers, or they can subscribe to that property that you make available on a particular web part. And this can work both ways, but it all works off of this idea of having a publisher or a source of that dynamic data, and then there are other web parts and things on the page that can consume that data. So they basically say, hey, when your dynamic data property changes, I want to be notified, and then I can do something with it inside of my web part. So let's take a look at what this looks like whenever you're working in your SharePoint Framework web parts. We're going to jump over here into our Hyper application where I've already prepared sort of a demo web part. This is very simple to start with. So this isn't anything that we haven't covered in the rest of the course, just a little bit of a different UI and really just try to make a really simple web part that is going to make it really easy for us to add some dynamic data to it. Let's go ahead and open this up in Visual Studio Code. We'll take a look at the code in a moment, but basically all it consists of is in the web parts folder, you'll see we have this earnings web part. There's our web part entry file, and it is a React-based web parts. There's also an earnings component, a TypeScript component or TSX file, as you see there. And if we go back into Hyper, we'll go ahead and run gulp serve to launch this local workbench in our web browser. Great. So we have our local workbench up and running in our web browser here. I'll go ahead and add our earnings web part, as you can see here. And this is all it does. It's basically just a list of 5 items, the same sort of data we were working with when we were building our dashboard web part throughout the course. So it has some earnings data that is broken up by quarter, as you can see here. And basically what you can do with each of these items is you can click on them to select a row. That's basically all this web part does. And I didn't even take the time to go and make it connect to lists and do dynamic data and stuff like that, because we already did that in the course, and that's just going to be extra code that you'd have to sift through. So I literally made this as simple as possible. This data is actually just JSON. So if you actually notice in the web part manifest file, this is just JSON data. I'm setting the earnings property in our manifest and just hard coding some JSON data right into the web part manifest. There's no editors. There's nothing when you actually go to edit this. There's no settings or anything to change on the web part. It's just super simple. It's meant to just display some simple data and then select it. But one thing that is going on in this web part is if we take a look at the web part entry file, you'll notice that first of all, we've described this interface that's describing the array of JSON data, which consists of a title and then 4 quarters of earnings, which are numbers. So you can see that interface there. The only web part property in this web part is a property called earnings, which is of course an array of earnings, which is defined up here. And then finally, if we scroll down a bit, the only special thing we've done here is we've mounted our React component just like you would normally expect and a React-based web part. But we did kind of do this special thing where we have this private property of our class called selected earnings, which again is an instance of the earnings interface that we defined up above. And then we even have a private method that is called onSelectEarnings, and then it basically just updates this property right here. And we pass that down to our React component. So basically what this does, if I just add console log new earnings selected, and then we just log that out. All it's doing is just keeping track of which earnings you've clicked on and you've selected basically. And if we jump back into our browser here and I click, you'll notice, let me clear the console and do that again just so it's a little bit easier to read. But you'll notice here in the console, it's of course just logging out the data that we've selected. So whichever one we click on, 2017 in this case, it's going to give us the quarterly earnings for that particular earnings data that we selected. And the reason why we're doing this is because in order to demonstrate dynamic data, really you can do this any way you want. You can use it however you can think of. It's just a matter of saying, okay, this is a source of data and this is going to subscribe to that data. But what I want to do in this case is I want to turn this web part into a data source so that we can take whichever earnings year that you've clicked on and we can provide its data as a source to other web parts on the page. And that's going to be the first thing that we do today is learn how to create a dynamic data source using a web part in our custom solution. And if you prefer to work along as we go through this video, you can click on the link in the video description down below to download the starter solution, which is going to give you a code base or a project solution that's exactly this state. So that way you can work along exactly as you're going to see here. But what we're going to do is I'm going to take out this console.log and we're basically going to update this entry file. This is the only thing we need to update when we're working with dynamic data is we're going to update this entry file to basically say, hey, this is a dynamic data source. This web part will provide dynamic data to other web parts on the page that can subscribe to it and use that data for whatever purpose they want. So the first thing we're going to do is on our class definition here, we have export default class, earnings web part, extends base client side web part, and then it passes in the props for the web part, the interface for the props as a generic type argument there. What we're going to do is right after that, we're going to add implements, and then we're going to import an interface called dynamic data callables. And this is a new interface that's available only in version 1.7 and later. And you can hover over that to sort of see what it does. But whenever you import that, if you use autocomplete, it's going to go ahead and automatically add an import up top here. If for some reason yours doesn't automatically add it, you can just copy and paste this line and paste it into your solution. But it's going to import this from a new package called SP Dynamic Data. And immediately you're going to get some linting errors. So you can see it's saying that, hey, you specify that this is going to be a dynamic data callable, but you haven't added all the required stuff to your class yet. So we do need to add a couple extra things in order for this to work. And this may feel a little tedious at first, but honestly, it's just a few things you need to add to your web part to make it a dynamic data source. Just some code and some things we need to do to make sure that we have a little bit of control over how the dynamic data behaves when we're passing it back and forth between web parts. And the first thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and make a new protected onInit. So we're going to say whenever you initialize this web part, we want to add some custom code there. And this does need to return a promise of type void. And within this method, you have to return promise.resolve just to make the linter be happy, because it does need to return a promise even if it's not an asynchronous function. But in this case, what we want to do is we want to say, hey, let's register a dynamic data source. So we're going to say this.context dynamic data source manager. And that's a new property that's available in 1.7. And we're going to initialize a data source. And then this expects a iDynamic data callable. So that's why we added this implements iDynamic data callables up here, is because we want to actually make this, or our web part itself, to be the dynamic data source. So the web part will be providing dynamic data in this case. And the next thing we want to do, if we scroll down a bit, is we want to create another method on this class that's going to define the name and the ID of the dynamic properties that we are creating and making available to other web parts on the page. And that's going to be public get property definitions. And that needs to return a read-only array of type iDynamic data property definition. I know that's a mouthful, but that's just the type that it must return. And again, your autocomplete should automatically handle importing the interfaces at the top here from this SP dynamic data source. But if for some reason you have trouble with that, just copy and paste that either from documentation or from our final source code. Either one will work just fine. And of course, we need to return something from this method because we need to return this. And basically, we're just going to return an array. And then each object in the array needs to be of this interface, which is basically just an object that contains some sort of ID and some sort of title. That's all you need to do. So in this case, I want to create a property where every time you click on one of these rows that has quarterly data, we're just going to create a property called total. So we're going to provide a value called total to other web parts on the page, which will basically just equal the total sum of all the quarterly earnings for the particular year that we have selected. We're not quite done yet. So yet another thing we need to provide here, a new method on this class, is going to be public get property value. So we need to kind of define what happens when another web part tries to get the value of our total property that we've defined. And your web part could potentially have multiple dynamic properties. So this needs to take in a property ID of type string. That's going to define what property you actually want to provide. And let's just go ahead and return number because we want our total to be a number in this case. And you basically need to check and say, like, if the property ID is total, then return this value or whatever. You can kind of do whatever you want in this method, but the simplest thing is probably to just say if property ID is equal to total, then let's just go ahead and return this dot selected earnings. And again, we're updating our selected earnings in this method up here. So this selected earnings is an iEarnings that consists of this data on this class. So what I want to do is I just want to add up Q1 through Q4 and return that as a single number from this method. Because again, I want to return the total in this case. So we'll say this dot selected earnings dot earnings Q1 plus, and then let's just copy this and paste it a couple times, Q2, Q3, Q4. And if for some reason a web part is trying to request a property that doesn't exist, we need to throw an error here. So let's just say else throw new error, invalid dynamic data property ID, or whatever you want there. Cool. So all that is looking good. The very last thing we need to do is we need to say, hey, other web parts that are listening to this total property that's being provided from this web part, there's a new value. So we already have a method that's happening. Every time you select earnings, we're running this on select earnings. So basically what we'll do is we'll notify subscribers of new property value. What we'll do is we'll just say this.context dot dynamic data source manager dot notify property changed. So basically we can just say, hey, the total property just changed. And you can fire that event off from anything you want. You could do it from some React components, or you could pass it around and do whatever you need to do. But you do need to notify other web parts that are listening to this total property that, hey, something changed, the value changed to that. So every time, in this case, somebody selects new earnings, we're going to go ahead and just notify people that change occurred. Now, if I save this and we go and look in our Hyper application, you'll notice that nothing's failing. We have a successful build. However, in the browser, nothing has changed, but it is a working web part. So behind the scenes, what we've done is we've created a dynamic data source, and we have this property called total that can now be subscribed to by other web parts on the page. Unfortunately, in the local workbench, there's no way to test this. I can't really tell what's going on. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to build another web part that will consume this total property, and then we'll deploy both of those and kind of test them out and see how this works in our dev environment. So let me jump back into Hyper. We'll go ahead and stop our local workbench now that we have that web part up and running. And let me clear this, and I'm going to cd into a new directory where we have similarly a different web part that we've already kind of set up. Again, you can download the starter solution for this in the video description down below if you're working along. But basically, we can take a look at this. This one's even simpler than the other one. It's basically, it's a web part we're calling total. And here's our entry file here. It's a React web part, just like the earnings web part that we just looked at. But it has a single web part property called total, which is of type number. Now, at the moment, this doesn't have anything to do with dynamic data. So this is just a pure web part, and I'll show you exactly how simple it is. If we run gulp serve and start up our local workbench for our total web part, you'll see that it is a super simple web part. We'll add it to the page here. There's our total web part. We'll edit this, and you'll see this is all it is. It's just a total value. I'm doing a little bit of number formatting, so we add commas in here and a $sign, but that's it. It's just a number input with a slider. Super simple, but you can imagine you might be able to build out a dashboard where it displays nice numbers and nice totals and stuff like that. And so what we want to do is we want to change this web part, this total web part, so that it has the ability to, instead of having a slider be the input for this total value, we can optionally have it select a dynamic data source and display that value instead. So the earnings web part is going to provide a total value, and this total web part is going to consume the total value and display it on the page here. So let's jump back into the code and we'll make that change. So first of all, we're already passing total as a web part prop down to our React component. So you'll see right here, we're passing total, which is a prop on our React component using this.properties.total. So let's change this web part property to be dynamic. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to change the type of our total property up here to dynamic property. And it's going to import, and that's of type number. And you'll see up here, it imports that from SP component base. That's a new class that's available on SP component base. And now we're going to change our render method, which you can see here. It's saying, hey, that's not a number. That's a dynamic property. We can't pass that down to our React component. So what we're going to do instead is up here, we're going to say get dynamic props, and we're going to say const total is of type number, or it could potentially be undefined, is going to equal this.properties.total.try get value. So it's going to try to get the value from the dynamic data source, and if so, this is going to be set to number. Otherwise, it's going to be undefined, and we'll just pass that down to our React component instead of passing the web part property down. So I wish it were that easy, but we do have to add a couple extra things here to kind of help the web part out and help it understand how to parse data. Because behind the scenes, what happens with dynamic data is when you're passing data back and forth between your web parts, SharePoint Framework basically serializes that data. So it kind of, even if you have this deep object structure that you're passing back and forth, it kind of crunches it all down into a very flat JSON object, and it sends it over to the next web part, which then has to reparse that serialized data and turn it back into data. So it's kind of like you're packaging up and then unpackaging in the destination web part, if you will. But basically what we need to do is we need to create a protected get properties metadata. So we're going to create this property called properties metadata, which is of type I web part properties metadata. And this needs to return an object that's going to have total, because that's our dynamic property in this case. And total is going to be an object where dynamic property type is number. And this is basically just helping SharePoint Framework do that serialization, because whenever it crunches your data down and it goes back to kind of parse it, it doesn't know if your properties are going to be numbers or if they're going to be strings or objects or whatever. So you can see if you hover over here, you have to set this to string, number, Boolean, object, or array. And that just helps it sort of parse the dynamic properties whenever it reads that from the serialization. And then finally, the last thing we need to do is we're going to have to change the method that is used to edit this web part, because right now this is all tied to this total value slider. And we need to have the ability for the user to select which dynamic data property they want to use as the total value. So the last thing we're going to do is we're going to scroll down here to our get property pane configuration method on our class here. And we're going to update this to kind of to do what they call a conditional property pane group that will allow us to kind of switch back and forth. So we can say the user wants to manually enter the value, and in that case, it's going to work just like it works now. Or they want to choose a dynamic value. In that case, it's going to replace the property pane with some new functionality. And this looks a little bit different, but basically what we want to do is we need to add around this object within our groups array here. We're going to create a new object that surrounds this. So let's tab all this over. And this new object is going to be of type I property pane conditional group. And that's a special interface, but basically what it allows us to do is to define a primary group, which is going to be this object right here. And then also we can have a secondary group. So this is a conditional property pane group because it's going to allow us to switch between the primary and the secondary group based on some criteria. And in our secondary group, this is where we're going to add our dynamic data. And what we can do here is we can say, first of all, just like we have in our primary group, we give it a group name, which is going to be, we'll set it to value just like it was up above. And we're also going to have group fields, which is an array, just like it was up above. But instead of adding a property pane slider like we did up above, what we're going to do here is we're going to add property pane dynamic field set. And this is going to be, it's going to take an object, and that object needs to have a label. So we'll just add total as the label here. And then it also needs to have a fields array. And the fields array, you want to fill this with property pane dynamic fields. So we can import this dynamic field, which is basically, it works a lot like all your other property pane fields. So you give it a property name, and then you pass it some options. So we're going to give it the property name down here, total, and then we'll pass it some options like the label. We'll add total value there, like so. So that probably seems kind of crazy, but again, what we did is we defined a primary group that gives us one view in our property pane. And then if some conditions are met, we have a secondary group that is made up of the SharePoint Framework built-in property pane field set. So this is actually really cool. You'll see when we use this in the browser, it basically adds a whole bunch of functionality that you don't have to build yourself that allows the user to select which dynamic properties they want to add to this particular property. But before we can actually get that to show up, we do need to add one final thing here. After our secondary group, we need to add show secondary group, which is a Boolean value, so that can be true or false. And we can basically set this to this.properties.total.try.get_source. And basically what that method will return, if you do the 2 exclamation points and then put this method in here, it's basically going to be true whenever a dynamic data source is set, and it'll be false if it isn't. So this allows us to kind of switch back and forth very easily between those two options. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like inside of our browser. You can see here, if we edit this, we still have the ability to set the total value, but we also have a new ellipsis appearing up here. And if I click on that, you'll see it says connect to source, and I can now connect this value or this total property to a dynamic data source. So in this case, I can say select the page environment, select site properties, current user information, query string. So again, I can't really test this with other web parts in the local workbench, but you can actually there's already dynamic data that's available in the page context, and there's this page environment variable. So for example, you could get a site link, and it's going to display the value of the site, which doesn't make sense for this total web part, but you can kind of see how our web part is basically pulling in whatever dynamic data that we select here and displaying that in the place that it would normally display the total amount there. And while we're here, just a quick note about this conditional group that we've created in the web part property pane. Basically, the user can choose between a manual value and a dynamic property by switching back and forth using that ellipsis. It's also entirely possible and feasible to not have a manual fallback. You could basically just not use the conditional group and just use a normal property pane dynamic field set. And by not using that conditional group, you don't have this idea of switching back and forth. You can basically just force the user to choose a dynamic property. So now that this is actually working, what we want to do is we want to deploy both of these web parts to a SharePoint environment, and then that way we can test this out with actually connecting the two web parts. Okay, so let's jump back into Hyper. I'm going to stop our local workbench. Let's go ahead and clear out this console, and we will run gulp bundle in ship mode, just like we did with the web parts we deployed in the course previously. And then we'll also run gulp package solution also in ship mode. And let's go ahead and open SharePoint, or rather open SharePoint/solution, and you'll see that'll open up our file here that we want to deploy. And what we'll do is we'll jump into the web browser. I need to go to the app catalog for my SharePoint tenant, which you can see I already have open here. And we will take our total file. We will drag and drop it in here to deploy it. There's our total web part. We'll go ahead and click on deploy. And now that that's deployed, let's do the same thing for, if I go up to our earnings directory, let's clear this. We'll do gulp bundle in ship mode. We will also do gulp package solution in ship mode. And then we will open SharePoint/solution to open that up in Finder on the Mac here. And let's also drag and drop our earnings package right in there to deploy our earnings web part. So these have both been deployed. I have a site where we can go, and even a page where we can go ahead and add these. So you can see here I have this empty page called dynamic data. Let's go ahead and edit the page. Oh, and before we do this, I need to go to add the app to this site before we actually are able to do that. So let's first, before we do that, let's go ahead and add our earnings web part. And there we go, it added that. And we'll also go ahead and add our total web part. And if we give that a refresh or two, it should go ahead and deploy that web part as well. There we go. So that has been deployed. Let's go back to our dynamic data page. Let's go ahead and edit this page and let's add these web parts. First, we'll add earnings on the left. There's our earnings data. Next, we will add total on the right, which if I edit this, you can see I can set a manual value, or now that this has been deployed, I can connect it to a source, and you'll notice in addition to our page environment, I now have earnings as a dynamic data source, the web part that's already on the page. And then you'll see here, if I select from earnings properties total, now as I select items, I'm gonna see the total for each of those years over on the right, which is pretty cool. Let's go ahead and publish this. We can say that we're done there. And this is a really, really simple example of dynamic data, but as you can probably imagine, you can use this for all sorts of stuff. You can pass all sorts of data back and forth between web parts. You can build out all kinds of neat things. In this case, it's just showing a simple example of kind of a drill down, like you select from a list over here and you see a detailed view over here, but you could certainly expand this to have more and more complex scenarios, and it's a really awesome feature that we now have in the SharePoint framework. So I definitely encourage you to check this out. If you want to take a look at the source code for both of these web parts, I have links for both of those in the video description down below. Go ahead and take a look at that. Feel free to use those for whatever it is you want. I'll also post a link to Microsoft's official documentation on dynamic data, and hope that you're feeling more comfortable with that and you feel really good about it and you're ready to build your own dynamic data web parts as well. Stay tuned for an update on SharePoint Framework 1.8. There were actually quite a few features in 1.7 that were in beta or preview that made it into the subsequent update in 1.8. So I'm not going to go over those preview features that were in 1.7 in this video. I'm going to very quickly post another video following this one that's going to cover all of the cool stuff that's now available in SharePoint Framework 1.8. So be on the lookout for that and stay tuned for further updates.